picture of you for my boss so it looks like I am doing work. Yes, thank you, thank you. All right, so my name is Joyce Lynn. I traveled here from San Francisco. Did anybody travel farther than me to get here? Okay, we have one contender over there. I am the head of developer relations for Postman, so hello from Postman. If you're expecting a talk about Postman, I'm so very sorry. Come talk to me afterwards. This is not a talk about Postman. But Postman is an API collaboration platform currently used by over 17 million people from around the world. And the best part of my job, besides traveling to exotic locations like this, is I get to talk to, by now I've talked to thousands of teams about their API development workflows, and I get to share what they've learned in talks like these. So the name of this talk is The Life-Changing Magic of Becoming API First: How to Transform Your Cluttered API Development Workflow into one of Insight and Efficiency. Starting with, what does API First mean? How many people know what that means or have heard of it before? Oh, okay, more than I would have thought for this crowd. Very shy hands, though. I wasn't going to call on anyone. We'll talk about the benefits of becoming API first, some practical tools and workflows, and throughout, I'll be sprinkling some industry examples. And if it's your first time hearing about API first, there are some pretty meaty concepts. So if everything floats out of your head, we will go over a high-level summary of takeaways. So let's get started. What does API first? I'm sorry if I'm yelling. I literally can't hear anything right now. What does API first mean to you? So I feel like 40 to 50% of you have heard of it before, but not super confidently because they were like half-raised hands. In 2020, Postman issued a State of the API survey. About 13,000 people responded, and we asked them, what does API first mean to you? You can see 13% aren't really sure of what it means or they've never heard of it before. And 87%, the remaining bars there, said they were familiar with API first, but they're undecided on what it means. So we're going to start with the broadest definition, API first development, and then narrow down to design first API development using specifications. Okay, so what is the opposite of API first? UI first? I can't hear anything, so you're gonna have to yell. Okay, well, you jumped straight to the answer, but the opposite of API first is API last, otherwise known as a code first approach. So with code first, this is gonna look really familiar to anybody who's ever developed an API. You start with the core functionality, and when you're done, you slap on an API and use that API to build out your app. And then somebody's gonna tell you, we need to support these other users. We have other stakeholders. So you rework the API, maybe you update the core functionality, and then you can support these new users. Now you have another service you need to support, this time for internal consumers. Now you need an entirely separate API. So this is a very common workflow. In fact, Etsy is one company that famously transitioned to API first. Stephanie Shermer of Etsy says, all of the code that was built for the website then had to be rebuilt in our API to be used by mobile apps. So they didn't anticipate mobile. Mobile wasn't a thing when Etsy launched, and they had to build everything twice. So after this very expensive learning experience, Etsy adopted an API first approach. What does API first look like? This time you start with your API first. I'm not quite there yet with specifications, but you start with your interface first, thinking about your potential consumers. And then your application engineers, the first app that you build will be the first consumers of your API, paving the way for other platforms and services, and that's the broadest definition of API first, building and exposing new functionality as an API first. So this is API first versus code first, conceptually. But tactically, what does this look like? With API first, you start with, well, that's code first. With code first, yes. Of course, you start with code. You're in your IDE, you're tapping out code, and when you're ready to commit your changes, you push them up to source control. They're in a repo somewhere, and once they're there, you can deploy that code. And at that point, only at that point, can testers start writing tests, can tech writers start writing documentation, can other consumers start consuming that API. So most people that have developed APIs before are familiar with this waterfall approach. And what are the problems with that? What does not spark joy? So you have bottlenecks. Anywhere you have a bottleneck, you have to wait until the point that the API is deployed before anybody can start weighing in on it. Potential stakeholders can then say, I don't really like that about your API. And so you have rework later in the development cycle when it's more costly. And sometimes you're building stuff that no one wants because your PM, your project managers, your business managers aren't able to weigh in until a later stage. So over the life cycle of an API, a code-first approach becomes a lot more expensive and resource-intensive. So API first. This time you start off you could use Postman, but there's a host of other tools to develop your API. You start off by designing and mocking your prototype. You might actually start writing tests. Test-driven development is another form of API first. Once you agree on a plan, you have a bunch more stakeholders weighing in on the design. Once you agree on that plan, some tools let you generate server-side code, and you commit that code to your source control, and now you can start running tests. You can start generating from the earlier design. So at the earliest stage of the API development lifecycle with API first, different stakeholders weigh in and gain consensus on the design or specification for the proposed API. And you might already see the key difference here. With API first, you're getting feedback earlier in the development cycle so the team can adapt to more realistic scenarios because you have more stakeholders weighing in on the design. You're decoupling dependencies so that you can have parallel development with testers, with writers, with potential consumers of the service. And then you can grow faster, and you're not constrained by the business model, you're not constrained by the data model, rather, or anything that's already been baked. So one more company, famously known for their API first approach. What's a company that's really well known for API first? Spotify? I feel like somebody's gonna get it. This is probably the most well-known company, Netflix. So Ben Christensen said, a single team should not become a bottleneck, nor need to have expertise on every client application to create optimized endpoints. Rapid innovation through fast decoupled development cycles across a wide variety of device types and distributed ownership and expertise across teams should be enabled. Do you know when he wrote this? This was 2013. So API first has been around for quite a while. Netflix was one of the pioneers of that. They were reconfiguring their API architecture to achieve concurrency, but they ended up with a distributed API workflow. So they're famously known with every team being super independent and not bottlenecked by other teams. So let's look at that bar chart again. What does API first mean to you? Let's just rephrase some of those definitions at the bottom. And I don't even know if you can see it, but let's just put it into words that we've just gone through. So the broadest definition is going to be developing and exposing new functionality as an API first development. Sometimes people take it a little bit further and are more strict with the definition, designing and developing the API using a schema or a specification. And lastly, defining business requirements. So this one's poorly worded, so I'm going to completely discount this one. But having business requirements, planning out how your consumers are going to be consuming this API. So this is what most people mean when they say API first. Who's right? How many people think it's API first development? How about design first? Okay, so I feel like more hands went up with design first, Postman, in another question for that survey, they asked people to rate themselves on a scale of 0 to 10. How fully do you embrace an API-first philosophy? And you can see a normal distribution, right? A lot of people are judging themselves, not even knowing what API first means, but they take the API pretty seriously in their organization. So if you look at the people that rated in the top quartile, so people that rated themselves as pretty darn API first, 7 and higher, let's call those API first leaders. These are people that self-identify as being API first. They defined API first as defining and designing APIs and schema. So I was actually talking about API first a few years ago at a web development conference, and I swear nobody had heard about API first. Devs were like, it's an interesting concept, but they're not doing it yet in my org. It's really changed pretty drastically in the course of 2 short years. More and more large companies are going API first. So this is the definition that we're going to be working with for the rest of this talk. It's designing the API first, most of the time using a schema, otherwise known as a specification. This is usually what people mean in larger companies when you have a governance team talking about API first, when you have PMs talking about it. So let's dig a little bit deeper. What tools and workflows are used for becoming API first? Postman? Yeah. Postman, but let me give you 3 tactical tools. So API specifications, how many people work with an API spec right now on your team? Okay, so I literally see maybe 10 hands. It's very surprising to me because I feel like there's a lot of Infobippers out here. So API specifications, we'll go over them very at a high level. Mock servers, who uses mocks? Yeah, mocks, a lot more hands there. Who does consumer-driven contract testing? 0. Oh, maybe somebody was chewing fingernails. No, 0 people in this room. This is very exciting. Okay. So let's talk about API specifications. Let's go over the terminology. Okay, so when people talk about API specs, when people are talking about API specifications, they could be talking about the format, a standard way of describing APIs, like Open API. That's one of the more popular ones. Who has heard of Open API? Okay, there we go. Lots more hands there. Sometimes they're talking about the document, the API description of a particular API. So Twitter is one company that uses Open API to describe their public APIs and private APIs too, but that's what Open API spec file is. And then the documentation, the API reference, how to use that particular API. Twitter's dev portal actually publishes an Open API specification. So in the case of Open API, the document or the spec file can be used to auto-generate API docs, API tests, virtualized services. People use that spec file to generate a lot of the stuff that they're planning on using. So we asked people to tell us, self-report, what API spec formats do you use? Okay, so this is 2020. JSON schema is huge. They're actually not even a specification, so you can disregard there. But you can see most of the popularly, reportedly used specifications. Swagger 2.0 is actually rebranded to Open API version 2. This is a self-report. Let's look at actual usage. So I work at Postman. 17 million developers, can't be wrong. What are they actually using? What you can't see in this pie is that yellow sliver encompasses Swagger v1, Waddle, and Raml. So very minimal usage, and the lion's share goes to Swagger, Open API version 2, or Open API version 3. And if you look at it month over month, Open API version 3 is actually huge with growth right now, even more than accounting from the loss of the other formats. So let's see, I believe Infobip uses Open API as well. Let's see Open API in action. If this works. Okay, so we are in Postman here. This is what an Open API spec file looks like if you've never seen one. We're using version 3. This is an explicit description of your data structures, of your endpoints. A lot of times you'll have paired requests and responses. And once you propose your specification, you describe what you want your API to look like, you're usually negotiating with consumers and saying, hey, I think this should look like that, or that's a sucky data type, please make it this instead. So OpenAPI is used to propose and describe an API, as well as the communication tool to then negotiate what that API will look like. And remember, a lot of people use OpenAPI to auto-generate documentation, tests, mock servers. Let's take a look at that. Okay, so I saw a lot of people do use mocks. Mocks can be used for a lot of things. You can use it for testing, you can use it for prototyping, designing an API. For API first, once all stakeholders agree on the intended vision for an API, they use the OpenAPI spec to generate mocks. Let's see what that looks like. So this is that same OpenAPI file. Once it's been agreed upon, you can use it to generate, from the API schema, a mock server. And a mock server is the same thing as a real server, except it's spun up really quickly and usually hosted on somebody else's cloud. In this case, we're using Postman Cloud. And there is our cloud-hosted mock base URL. And in Postman, when you generate a mock server, you also have a collection. And you can see that the base URL right now is going to a local host because that's what the spec said. But if we plop in our cloud-hosted mock domain, we'll make a call to our mock server going to /mocks endpoint. And we can use a mock server the same way we would use a deployed API. How many people have used mocks that way? Okay, actually quite a bit of hands go up. So we used OpenAPI in this example to generate our mocks, and we can use it to prototype a new service. We can have a PM who's never going to be using Postman on their own, but they'll consume an endpoint. And then this allows us to have parallel development. Because remember, in that code-first approach, our fellow stakeholders weren't able to get started until the very last step. But in this case, once you agree on a specification, you spin up those mock servers, and now consumers can write tests against those mocks. Tech writers can start documenting actual mocks that are then going to be swapped out with the real endpoints. Independent services can start building against those integrations. All right, and the last workflow we'll talk about is consumer-driven contract testing. Not a single hand went up. Maybe somebody crept in that has done consumer-driven contract tests. How many people operate with a microservices architecture? Okay, so a ton of hands went up. And so you're familiar with potentially being dependent on another team's output, and you're probably familiar with having something that they release break your own workflow. Consumer-driven contract testing is something that the Postman engineering team uses to prevent breaking changes with our own microservice architecture. So for CDC testing, you have an API provider, and let's just think about it in the microservices example, because a bunch of people are familiar with that architecture. In this example, the provider, the API provider that's providing this service, says, this is how you should use my API, and hands off a specification. Potential consumers, like other microservices, then write tests about how they plan to use the API. Here's how you should use my API. Thank you. This is how I am using your API. And in fact, the tests only test endpoints and properties that that consumer is interested in. That communication loop results in a contract, or you might have heard this called a pact, between the API provider and consumers. And then when the API provider is ready to push code, they have to run those CDC tests, those consumer-driven contract tests, before any changes are deployed. So that's how you protect the workflow and prevent breaking changes from going out to the next update. So Postman engineering follows this workflow for spinning up new services. We start off with a specification. Right now, of course, we use Postman collections. We use Postman collections to describe our API. We're also working with Open API because, as you saw, everyone's working with Open API. And we're also experimenting with async API for event-driven architectures. So we start off with that specification to propose and negotiate a new service. And then engineers spin up a mock. We use our own mocks, of course. And it's based on example API calls articulated within the specification, and that enables parallel development. In our case, we don't have like a separate group of testers or a separate group of tech writers, but it's the dependent services, the other microservices that are getting started in parallel. And as the engineers progress further along with API development, they need to run those CDC tests before they can push any new code. All right, so what are the key points for becoming API first? If you're like, blah, 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 so many words, what are the key things that you should take away? Well, when people say API first, it's not always clear what they mean. Sometimes I talked to somebody last week that was talking about API based, meaning, yay, I love APIs. So API first, if you're talking to your governance team or a PM, most API first leaders are talking about that second definition there, API first design using a specification. So that encompasses the whole planning workflow. What functionality will the API have? What data will expose? What will the developer experience be like? All of that kind of stuff. And the benefits of an API first approach. When you invite more stakeholders to weigh in on the design early, that means you have more realistic scenarios and you're actually building stuff that people want. In Postman Engineering's case, we use it to enable parallel development. And in the case of Open API, you can actually generate documentation, generate tests, generate mocks from that spec so that you can scale faster and more efficiently. So is API first for everyone? I'm giving a whole talk about API first. Should every one of you take this back to your teams? Well, it depends. So if you take a look at this nice table, you have most businesses are now supporting multiple platforms and devices. That's not a trend that's slowing down. Lots of organizations like Postman are breaking down their monoliths in favor of something maybe like microservices and adopting new cloud hybrid solutions. None of those trends are slowing, and the growth of APIs is not slowing. But you might not follow an API-first workflow if you're at a startup or you're doing a project where your singular focus is going to be time to market. So API first typically takes a little bit longer at the beginning, but then it allows you to iterate faster after that first development cycle. If you're not even thinking about the next development cycle and you're still looking for product fit, or you're just doing a side project, then you probably don't need to be thinking about API first. And in fact, some of the speakers this morning were talking about that same thing. If you're not doing something as part of a very large organization that needs to scale, then it's a hammer. You don't need it. In fact, this is from Postman. This is Ken Lane, our chief evangelist at Postman. He said it's going to be hard. And I'm guessing this is a room full of developers. Most developers don't want to do API first. It's usually a manager telling them to do it because it's not what they're used to, and it's going to be hard. But given any kind of complexity, given any kind of scale, compared to 2 years ago, most large teams are going API first. And I think I have time for questions, but I can't hear anything, so I don't know how that's going to work. Oh, okay. Any questions? If you have questions about Postman, I'm happy to answer that too. I'm so sorry if you tuned in for a Postman talk and this was just me. No questions? Okay, no problem. Feel free to grab me in the hallway. It was nice to see you all.